Uh, Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this ordinary meeting of the Society. Can I say, firstly, to apologise that we've moved online, but I think you'll all understand that the COVID situation is such that we didn't really feel we had any alternative but to do so. Can I also apologise to those of you who were listening to the lecture last week online by Professor Teresa Singleton. We went offline as a result of a power cut on Piccadilly. We were able to continue in the room, but I'm very sorry to those of you who are trying to listen remotely that we weren't able to do anything to bring you back into the meeting. Minutes, John.
Society of Antiquaries of London, ordinary meeting Thursday, 2nd of December 2021, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President in the chair. The minutes of the previous ordinary meeting of Thursday, 25th of November 2021 were read and signed. The certificates of candidates for election were laid before the Society in order to be suspended in the usual manner. The following, being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statute, were duly admitted fellows: Tim Allen, Toby Parker, Linda Grant, and Teresa Singleton. The following communication was then laid before the Society: The Archaeological Heritage of Slavery in the United States by Professor Teresa Singleton FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced the next meeting will be on Thursday, 9th of December, and then adjourn the meeting.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. Following the results of today's ballot, I declare the following duly elected Fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of London: Anne-Marie Ankhurst, Angela Boyle, Laura Fernandez-Gonzalez, Catherine Freeman, Esker Joshua, Lillian Ladle, Timothy Lawrence, Lawrence Magnus, Gary Momba, Adam Smith, Anthony Tedeschi, Paula Ware, Duncan Wright. Certificates.
Thank you. David Oakey, BA, MA, a curator of decorative arts and previously assistant to the Deputy Surveyor of the Royal Collection Trust. Stephen Pollington, author and lecturer on Germanic, King Alfred and the Anglo-Saxons. Ryan Rabbit, BA, PhD, a senior lecturer in human paleoecology at the University of Quarry, medieval and post-medieval stained glass. Angela Trentacosti, BA, MSc, PhD, an archaeozoologist at the University of Oxford.
We seem to have lost Heather online. John, do you have the rest of the list there?
Yes, Heather was coming towards the end, actually. Angela Trentacosta, BA, MSc, PhD, archaeozoologist, University of Oxford, specialising in the prehistoric and classical Mediterranean.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is it your pleasure that these certificates be suspended in the usual manner? Thank you. We now come to the main pleasurable business of this evening's meeting, we're welcoming Sue Hamilton, who I think many of you will know, director of the Institute of Archaeology at UCL. Sue has a long and distinguished career in landscape archaeology and heritage of landscapes. She is going to talk to us this evening on Rapa Nui, Easter Island archaeology and heritage, changing narratives and current issues. Welcome, Sue.
Well, I'm hoping that everything is working okay. Can somebody confirm you can see everything?
We can.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome to my lecture or presentation for tonight. For those of you who are in the Northern Hemisphere, I hope the sunshine of the Pacific will cheer your evening in these difficult times. So here we are, the title of my lecture, Rapa Nui, or more popularly known as Easter Island, Archaeology and Heritage, Changing Narratives and Current Issues. I want to really look at Rapa Nui as something that is both past and present, because it very particularly is a living archaeology that is meaningful to the majority of its inhabitants today. So it's not something that one can just simply work in as a past artifact. It relates what I'm discussing today to a project which was initiated more than a decade ago by myself and Colin Richards. It then went on to get funding by the British Academy and ultimately by the HRC, where we had a major grant, and we had therefore some of the names which you see here came on board at that point as principal and co-investigator. So myself as principal, Colin Richards and Kate Wellham as co-investigators. And then as the project progressed, a whole raft of names relating to people who work for the Chilean National Park, who work in the Rapa Nui museums, local people from the Commission of Monuments in Chile, based in Rapa Nui, and increasingly more and more Rapa Nui people via Mauhunua, which is the Rapa Nui indigenous communities who are now in charge, in fact, as we will see, of the monuments on Rapa Nui, and various other people who've co-worked with me with research. And at the bottom of the list down here are all sorts of specialist people who've been invaluable in investigating different aspects of our work. The project as a whole, which is based at UCL, is called Landscapes of Construction of Rapa Nui. And by that, I mean looking at a landscape as an interconnecting whole, and that it is as much a social construction and an ideological construction in which there are various aspects of archaeology in terms of land use, monuments, etc. So that basically is the accreditations that go with this project. Well, I have to introduce you to Rapa Nui. For those who do not know, it is part of a World Heritage Landscape, which was designated in the mid-90s. It's a very small volcanic island, some 8 by 16 kilometers. And I think it does raise issues about how you deal with an island as a small whole, and how potentially to any person, past and present, who's lived on it, it is seen as a whole rather than a regional differentiation across it. There are some distinctive things about it. I said it's volcanic, and in each corner of its triangle, there are ancient volcano craters, not active ones, but ancient ones. And these are pretty much the main source of the island's fresh water. And they obviously do have some wider meaning. If we look to Polynesian cosmology as a whole, volcanoes are always a meaningful structure. They're interconnections between the sky, the land, and the underworld. And it's interesting on Rapa Nui that the crater which you see here, which is Rano Kau on the western tip, has actually got a surrounding area, sort of almost wrapping it, of various petroliths, as if to seal and protect it within its hull. And that cosmology is a theme which I want to come back to. To place you a little more, Rapa Nui has a remarkably isolated spot. It falls within the Pacific as a whole, which is a vast area of scattered islands, taking in Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. So Rapa Nui forms the eastern tip of the Polynesian triangle. And Polynesia is connected many thousands and hundreds of thousands of islands across the Pacific. Polynesia forms a whole, which is connected by language and DNA. Colonization of the Pacific is quite late in terms of deep prehistory. It begins around 1300 BC, and Rapa Nui is right at the end of that process. There's a controversy about when it actually happened, but any time between AD 800 and 1200, the earliest societies which we see in Rapa Nui colonized that island. And colonization is fascinating because it is against the current, and it's done by voyaging canoes, double-hulled voyaging canoes, via which the whole of the Pacific was colonized. And why was it colonized against the current? Well, I suppose if you didn't hit land, you could stop rowing or paddling and you'd be taken home to the west. So in Polynesian mythologies as a whole, the idea of origins, place from whence you came, the west across the sea, are pretty recurrent things where we do have ethnographies and documentations of them. So how was Rapa Nui found? I've said it was found at the tail end of a long series of voyaging from island to island right across the Pacific. It was found in terms of Western archaeologists and researchers and travelers by Roggeveen in 1722. So that's when it became part of our European world. And it was found on Easter Day, hence one name for it as Easter Island. From that period onwards, one could do quite a long history of incidental contacts with the island, different deliberate voyages to the island. And I just want to pick out one or two, because I do think they really set the background as to how people create narratives, which is in the title of my lecture, about Easter Island. They constantly and recurrently deal with a few very selected things, which almost create myths about the island. One is whether there were statues, whether they're standing, whether they've fallen down. Another one which constantly recurs is trees or lack of trees. So for instance, Roggeveen in 1722 says there are standing statues. Cook in his second voyage across the Pacific hit Rapa Nui, and he describes a lack of trees and many of the statues fallen. And he particularly emphasizes unseaworthy canoes, which actually suggests that the trees are not there to build the canoes to go yet further or escape. And there are pictures of later times where people have just got small canoes which can't go into deep water, made of planks. La Perouse noted with Easter Island at the end of the 18th century, a wasteland of barren rock, not a single tree more than 3 meters high. So we can track through these travelers' tales, as it were, or documentations, trees, guesses about how big or small the population was, and some form of collapse and fall down of statues run through all the narratives and stories. As we get into the 20th century, there are two people's work I particularly want to pick out. There's that of Catherine Routledge, she was the first person to do a full survey right across the island. She did some excavation, she measured and documented and drew all the sites and monuments which crossed the island, and she had a Rapa Nui informant who went with her and helped with her throughout the whole year that she was there. And she documents that there are about 250 people on the island. So guessed populations of who built all the statues of perhaps 6,000. By 1915, another sort of story begins to get into our narratives: population decline, loss of population, desolation. Moving further into the 20th century, and what actually got me to Easter Island, which is Aku Aku, and the novel or story or absolute documentation by Tor Heyerdahl of his trip to Rapa Nui or Easter Island. And he stayed there for a year with an American and Norwegian and Chilean team, and they excavated and did survey, again like Routledge, on an island-wide scale. And that's what I return to with the work of Landscapes of Construction. One of its key points is that it's on an island-wide scale. Tor Heyerdahl writes very engagingly about Easter Island, and it's a great route into popular archaeology. And one of his team, William Malloy, returned to Rapa Nui in the 60s and started restoring some of the monuments which are there, particularly the ceremonial monuments with statues. So the Rapa Nui we see today has restored monuments which Malloy began the process of. And it's really what makes the island attractive to tourists, that you can see standing statues, which goes back to the time of Malloy. So I just want to give you a bit of structure now in terms of what I want to talk about. There are quite a few things I want to talk about, so I have to just touch on them lightly to take you through the whole lot, but obviously with questions I can develop more. So first of all, I've emphasised, I think there has been in the past an over-focus on certain narratives about Rapa Nui, an over-focus on large-scale monuments, rather than the monumentality of building a whole landscape of settlement, field systems, through to the ceremonial monuments. So perhaps an over-focus on just monumentality. There's a great emphasis, and it goes into all the literature, on the collapse of civilizations, that something happened there, that the statues fell or were pushed over and society collapsed. And so by about 1600, the society that we are looking at, and our project is based on, the first colonization of Rapa Nui, that has gone and changed. Another narrative which runs through it is eco-disaster. I mean, these are very opposite to studying islands and the world in the present, but something actually happened that was disastrous in prehistory that led to collapse and misuse, apparently, of the landscape. And it's very much tied up with the idea of early deforestation. What I think is lacking from these narratives, and I hope our work is in some way redressing, is a study of Rapa Nui on an island-wide basis, not a single component of it, such as how were the statues moved, or work on the statue quarries, or all sorts of individual things, but a way of looking at Rapa Nui that crosses the whole island on an island-wide basis. I also would suggest that what is generally lacking is a Polynesian cosmological framework. Rapa Nui is part of Polynesia, and the cosmology of Polynesia, where we have it documented, is very distinctly different from a Western cosmology. So in the West, we have a focus on the individual. In parts of Polynesia, there's a focus on partability, that Polynesian chieftains unify and encompass the actions and lives of their whole community, so that they bring things together. They're not just a discrete individual. Or you might contrast that with Melanesia and the idea of the dividual, that an individual is actually split in many parts and dispersed right across a landscape and different actions. So I think this is really important, to not just think about things as contained in an individual whole, be it a monument or a person. And in order to explore that, I think patterning is a very important thing to look at on a landscape scale, looking at different types of sites at different scales and the concurrent and recurrent patterning they have, because this is what will link cosmology, space, and interpretation together. So those are the sort of backdrops and things I want to keep in mind as we go through the material. I'm going to show you some of this by the ongoing work of Locke, Landscapes of Construction, but at the end I want to think about its implication for heritage in contemporary Rapa Nui, where much of what we are looking at as archaeologists is pretty key to Rapa Nui identity today and its main source of income from tourism. Another theme I just want to run through with this is also this Polynesian idea of interface, which is the slides on the right or the pictures on the right, a consideration that the connection between different things is a dangerous place. So Polynesian tattooing, where the outside world hits the skin and the spirit of the inside world. The role of tattoos is to protect that layer. Or the relationship between land and sea in Rapa Nui and elsewhere. So it's seen as a dangerous interface. Land is where you live, sea is where you come from, sea is where you go on death, back to your ancestors and origin. So this idea of interfaces between danger and change, I think is a patterning that we could look at and develop via the slides I'm showing you tonight. So I want to first of all show you a bit of the archaeology and counter arguments to some of the narratives, and then we'll move on. So the emphasis is consistently, and what tourists actually go to Rapa Nui for, is its colossal monumentality, the dates of which you have there. And this is a classic Rapa Nui Ahu monument. It's a ceremonial platform. It's got a ramp up to it. At the front of it, there's a plaza, a flattened out, cleared area, 100 by 200 meters. On top of the platform, there are statues or ancestors, they're sometimes called, stone men or moai. They face inland, and at the back, there are crematoria where the dead are cremated and their ashes and the wind will take them to the sea and westwards to the place from whence they came as colonizers and spirits. This would be a Colonial framework of interpreting them as such. What more often than not is seen on visiting Rapa Nui and by the various travellers is this, a very dramatic image, as it were, of collapse, fallen statues and rubble, and there is much volcanic rubble on Rapa Nui. And of course, it's so dramatic. If you look at that statue, I'm always surprised that my body, is the size of the nose of the statue. So there is a very dominant scale that is bigger than the person, bigger, charismatic scale, I'd call it, of the statues on the Ahu or monuments. So what did happen and what information do we have relating to the idea of collapse? Well, one of the underlying views and ideas is that it relates to deforestation, which affected resources and ability to move statues. There's no doubt that Rapa Nui is quite deforested if you look at other Polynesian islands, such as the Marquesas or Hawaii. So when did that come about, and is it a problem? Well, there are places where we can get evidence that it clearly happened and when it happened. The volcano cores have fresh water in them, the lake cores, and from those we have pollen, which shows that fairly early within the statue building period that there was deforestation. So freshwater lakes will tell you about regional deforestation. More recently, with work by Locke, we've been looking at erosion and exposed sections under monuments, so that's pollen soil sampling. And we too are finding deforestation underneath those monuments, perhaps not unsurprisingly, at the moment they were built. So there's no doubt that Rapa Nui was deforested fairly early in its prehistory. And we've also got from our work on erosion and exposed sections evidence of fossil palm roots, which are very distinctive, these sort of multiple root holes, which you can see as a fret within the soil. Why, however, if you get deforestation, don't you get regeneration? And there's recent work, or relatively recent work, by Terry Hunt showing that the Chilean palm most likely was unable to regenerate due to rats eating the palm kernels. And Polynesian rats came over, we know, with the first Polynesian canoes of colonization. And going through old excavation material, for instance, at the Pitt Rivers Museum, we've actually come across these nuts or palm nuts, which have been gnawed by the Polynesian rat. So it's not just deforestation, but an ecological trend in which regeneration was not possible. It does actually beg the question as to whether it really matters. So here's a series of narratives as to why some people think it might matter. For instance, how do you move statues without large tree trunks? Well, there's many ways you can move a Rapa Nui statue, and large palm trunks would be a way of doing so. If you ask a Rapa Nui, they'll say they walked. How did the statues move? They walked, which I think is quite an imaginative route forward as well. So inability to move statues may have been something that changed with deforestation. We have many statues which lie prone, such as the one you see here, which I'll come back to later on. But there's the idea that statues were abandoned in transport because it was such a dramatic and accumulating event that the statues were increasingly difficult to move. If you do not have large trees, you cannot build canoes, you cannot go to sea. Is that a problem? Clearly, the earliest material from Rapa Nui shows a lot of fish bones, which then increasingly disappear. So perhaps not getting out to sea to get deep sea fish is a problem. But what we have prolific remains of is the Polynesian chicken, which came across with the first colonizers and is prolific. And we, in fact, have buildings known as chicken houses, which run right through the period of the statue building date. Then there's ideas of soil depletion leading to starvation. Moai kawai, such as you see here, kava kawai, are little wooden statues which look skeletal. If you go down this narrative, you could say maybe they are starving, but equally, are they spirits or representations of something other than emaciating beings? We have many of these right across the island, and indeed from our excavations, which are matai, which are in some narratives seen as weapons of warfare. I would think to most people, they don't really look like spears or something that could damage somebody necessarily that easy. Microware analysis by Terry Hunt, but also from our material from excavations at Punapau, in fact, shows that they were used for a whole series of things, cutting shell, cutting vegetation. And lastly, this idea that there's some sort of warfare at the end of the statue building period due to the inability of chiefs to make others through food and resources to move statues and maintain their status. So that's a sort of narrative of deforestation and collapse that many would go for. There are other routes through this, and they're interesting to note. You could say, and I would support, and most people would support, that depopulation is actually a modern 20th century issue of Rapa Nui. Rapa Nui, by the end of the 19th century, was annexed by Chile, and photographs we have from that point already show the community in a depleted state. There's all sorts of reasons to do with it, including some of them being taken away to work in quarries in Peru. There's disease introduced by Europeans, etc. And by the early 20th century, something interesting therefore happens, which is with shrinkage of people, increasingly the landscape is becoming empty. And this is maximized in the early 20th century by the leasing of the island for sheep farming, which takes place in the 1920s and goes through to the 1950s by a Scottish Chilean company. It was leased out, and the sheep are basically the occupiers of the Rapa Nui landscape. So the slide you see here are the sheepmen who actually brought in horses to the island, and the sheep themselves are being driven down a route to the sea over the top of one of these ahu, or a ceremonial platform. So out of that depopulation of the landscape and the leasing of the landscape to what is later known as the company, something remarkable happened in Rapa Nui, which very much affects our present day abilities to look at its heritage. The people were moved off the landscape, as you see top left, and they were confined to the one town of Rapa Nui, which is called Hangaroa. So this is just after Routledge's census and description of the island. So probably we have less than 250 Rapa Nui there now. They're moved into Hangaroa, and their whole life changes. Not only are they taken off their ancestral lands, but they're now put in rectangular buildings built of driftwood with open windows. And at the sort of more luxurious end of the scale, bottom right, are the houses of the managers, which are in a European colonial style. And what you see in the middle is a landscape you can still see today, which is the emptied out landscape of Rapa Nui, which is filled with monuments, but all sorts of incredible and very interesting small details. So we have on Rapa Nui, due to the horribleness of confinement to Hangaroa, a heritage landscape that's there on an island-wide scale. So this provides us with opportunities, and the Landscape of Construction project has taken those ideas and opportunities to look at Rapa Nui on an island-wide scale. And it allows us to think about themes and issues, some of which I just put up front here, but we have this idea of shapes and forms repeating themselves at different scales. So the ceremonial platforms are boat-shaped. They're called ahu. As you move inland, you have the first houses. They too are boat-shaped, just like the ahu. And they have big stone sea pebble pavements in front of them, just as the ahu, on a much larger scale, had their ramps adorned with sea pebbles. And then you move down to the scale of rock art, and there again, you have these boat shapes which represent ahu, or houses. Or at another level, you could look at routes down to the sea, which is a boundary between land and sea and ideological differences. So on a big scale, you have it as causeways between the ahu. On a smaller scale, you have boundaries to the houses. You have to go underneath the houses or bend low on your knees to get in. And that's a protected boundary as well. The house is boat-shaped, and it has small statues that are placed either side of it, just as the big statues are placed either side of the ceremonial monuments. Or you can take something like statue hats, which are evidence of prestige. You have large ones and you have miniature ones. Or if you take the statues themselves, you have huge statues, 40 feet high, and excavation has shown that at the base of some of them, you have little mini statues. And the one we have in the bottom right is one which Catherine Routledge excavated at the base of one of these large statues, in this case from the Quarry area. So what I want to do now is just take you across the landscape fairly quickly on LOC's Integrated Landscape Survey project. So the interface between land and sea is clearly very important, and it's interesting and distinctive that all the ceremonial platforms with statues on them ring the coast, the interface between land and sea. And the statues look inland, And between these ceremonial platforms, there are distinctive paved routes to the sea. And it's almost as if your exit to the sea is guarded by the statues on either side. So in a Polynesian concept, that's a very controlling feature of the edges of the island. There's also a sense of layering space. So these monuments, the ahu, have earlier statues at their bases on which new platforms are built for the statues. So there's a sense of building and ancestry, and it runs through more than just the ahu. So for instance, in front of the ahu, there are large runs of basalt flows, which are used to carve out the frontings or the penga for the ahu platforms. So they're drawing to them from the wider landscape this geology of the penga. And then where the penga are removed, there are planters or areas of soil which are used to protect new crops. So there's a sort of layering of use, which I find rather fascinating as well. Or if you go to the back of the ahu, where the crematoria are, they don't just contain bone, they contain all the substances of the island. They have red scoria, which the hats are made of, and this is ground down and put in to the crumbling mixture that's in the crematoria. They have pieces of sea algae pulled up from the sea and then crushed down and put in, and also white sea coral. So there's a sense that just a crematoria, a person, an ahu isn't a unit on its own. It integrates a whole series of substances and materials from the island as a whole. I've said there's been a lot of work on monumentality, looking at these small pieces of materials, and crematoria give just as much information and have a vast amount of work involved in their grinding. But perhaps the most obvious and dramatic feat of all is the clearing of the landscape in front of the ceremonial platforms. So to make those stone-free plaza, fists and numerous quantities of stone from the whole volcanic landscape has to be moved, and it's moved inland. And where is it moved to? Well, two things happen. One is that it's redeployed to bury other ahu, where statues have been laid down, so systematically transform the ahu themselves. But moving inland, it's actually moved in to make rock gardens. And so loss of trees isn't actually a problem because all this material is put inland and the crops are planted in between the rock mulch, and the rock mulch protects the soil underneath from erosion, but also keeps minerals within it. So Rapa Nui's got a remarkable feat of moving stones, not just erecting things on ahu, but moving things inland. And it is a very complex landscape as you go inland. There are the rock mulching areas. All of these things we've been mapping, and others have mapped them too. And there are manovi complexes, which are circular enclosures to protect crops. There are small stone ovens all across the landscape. And there are harang moai, which are buildings to protect and keep chickens in. So there's stone movement all the time, and the calcareous material moved to the rock gardens, in addition to the mulch, are being moved from sea to land. So there's a hell of a lot of monumental activity in terms of scale and connection between people moving all these stones. Nor is it badly managed, if that would be the narrative, in terms of water. There's fresh water in the volcano craters. Of course, they are few. There's three main ones which hold it. But there's control of water when it does rain. The work by the German team who are working on Rapa Nui has got located dams which are built to create banking up of water, fresh water in periods of heavy precipitation. There are sumps which are dug near the sea to access saline water, where the water table mixes with seawater. And we have a series of large basins, some may be for water, some not, called Taheta. Here are Rapa Nui houses, or the most elaborate ones, which are about 200 meters inland, up to 2 kilometers inland. And I think what's interesting about these, I've mentioned the boat shape, which repeats itself and mirrors the ahu and the idea of the canoe. Here are the sea pebbles, which are brought inland to give a frontage to it. Here is one in reconstruction, a very narrow entrance in to guard that sort of interface between inside, where you mainly sleep, and outside, where you live your life. And this is a survey of the bases of these Hari Penga. So Hari means house, Penga means stone. The bases which support the thatch superstructure are actually of many houses. They're not a single phase house at all. You can see by the different types of materials used and the different sizes of stone and the interface. This is where the superstructure would be put in. We've counted up to 6 different houses or reconstructions of these houses. So they're not flimsy things, they're ancestral things that build and layer on time, just as the ahu bases are built on preceding layers of broken up statues. I'm just keeping an eye on my time here, so forgive me if I speed and look at my watch. I just want to look at some of the excavation work and other work we've done on the LOC project. So what I've been looking at is the sort of surface and landscape scale of materials. 2 things I would like to now move on to. One was our first excavation there. It's the first excavation ever at Puna Pau, which is a volcano vent and is made of red scoria. It provides the red scoria for the hats which adorn some of the statues. Red is a very important colour in Rapa Nui and elsewhere in Polynesia. It relates to ritual status and strength. From our work at Puna Pau, we now have the first dates for it. It's just after the beginning of the statue period, AD 1300 to 1600, and it's obsidian hydration dating. We've done surface survey and resistivity survey right across Puna Pau. It's not a volcano crater in its natural state anymore. It's got extensive work and modification of it. And it's quite clear that there are various routes and trackways into it, which we've looked at through resistivity. And in this picture, the red indicates a harder area where there was an original track or pathway in. We've done limited excavation there, and it's become clear that the hats or the hat blanks which line the outside of the crater are actually placed rather than randomly abandoned. So this idea that lots of monumental work was abandoned isn't necessarily the case, and has prompted various ideas and decisions about how we might approach the quarrying procedures on Rapa Nui. So they are put in hollows, and one of them in particular had a very nice obsidian axe at its base, which looks like a placement deposit. As we went inside, we've looked at areas where the hats have been removed and the tracks they were taken up. But one of the most interesting things that this excavation came across was actually that above where a hat was removed, there are 2 carved eyes. And it very much falls in with Marquesian quarries and their ethnography, and the idea that red stone was living, and that as you carved out rock, more grew. So this gave us 2 sets of themes to look at the main statue quarry, which is Ranuraraku, the idea that what was happening wasn't necessarily an abandonment of procedures, but there were ceremonial routes and ways in, and this idea of a living rock. So this is Raniraruku. This is the outside of the crater of Raniraruku, and you can see part of it's already collapsed, but as you go to the right-hand side, if you look carefully, you'll begin to see that it's a whole area of carved statues. A traditional view would be that the statues which are still there and attached to the rock are interrupted work and abandoned, but we might question that there are other ways of seeing what's happening here. So you see statues set up around the outside, you see quarry spoil, and above it, if you look carefully, you'll see banks and banks of statues still attached to this volcanic rock. So around the outside, excavations by Thor Heyerdahl, by Rutledge and by Johann van Tilburg have demonstrated that the statues were actually set up to ring the quarry and that they were not taken away, but work was still continuing because they're covered and buried in quarry spoil. And we know from our own ground penetrating radar surveys that there are many more statues buried deep under that spoil. So only about 200 statues were ever taken away from Raniraruku and put on the ceremonial platforms, and at least 1,000 statues remain at the quarry. So it begs the question, is this just simply abandoned work, or are all these ranks of statues doing something rather different, which we could suggest is inscribing the crater as a special place, that they are actually there to protect the crater, just as rock art around the vents of other volcanoes, both in other parts of Polynesia, but we mentioned, and I showed you Raniraruku, might be doing the same thing. You really do have to work hard to unravel these things. So for instance, we have a statue here with its nose. Across it on the right-hand side, there's one lying across it, and then there's another right above it with its nose and head. There's no way any of those could be extracted without destroying the other. Part of our work was to look at the quarry walls. We were commissioned to do this, to see what was in the places that some statues have been removed from. It's a huge undertaking, and it was done by cameras on poles, by Adam Stanford, and also by drones or unmanned vehicles to take photographs. And in doing so, it became clear that there are many other things which are less well known on the quarry walls. And there are some petroglyphs, but what more we see is, if you look at the arrows, there are actually eyes. There are sets and pairs of eyes which have been put there as the statues were removed. And they're monumental. There's one set which are round like Punapau, but the bulk of these are elliptical and are, as you would see on the statues, at the Ahu. So there's a kind of referencing between place here. The statue is removed, the eyes are put there. When the statues are at the quarry, they are blind, such as top right. But as they are taken to the Ahu, their eyes are carved out, carved deep, and in some moments they are inserted with elliptical eyes, and they become seeing eyes that look inwards towards the quarry and the interior of Rapa Nui. So I'm just sort of touching at all these interfaces between ideas which come from looking at something on a landscape scale. So finally, if we just stick with Raniraruku in terms of our work, leading from Raniraruku, the statue quarry, are a series of roads which have been long known and can be seen from satellites and aerial photographs. Some of them are more obvious than others. Some have road curves, for instance. And along these roads, there are prone statues. If you took an idea of collapse and abandonment and unable to continue with work, you might call these statues, which were lost and abandoned in transport through a breakdown of society and resources. Work done on them with the ideas that we've been developing and I've discussed with you, and also work by Heyerdahl, suggests that actually they were on platforms and there are areas of high resistance around some of these statues. So it may suggest that they were not abandoned in transport, but once standing and at some time have fallen. In order to look at this a little more, we've worked with CONAF, who was then the Chilean National Parks Authority, to look at the weathering on these fallen statues. A Belgian team's looked at the back of these statues, but we particularly focused on the front of them. And it can be seen through 3D photographic mapping that under the belly of the statue, they're much more protected and there's less erosion. And that would have more likely happened and could only have happened when they were standing, because the belly would have protected the lower part of the statue from weathering. So what I've done there is just gone through a very rapid route of the interconnectivity of some of the ideas and how looking at something on one part of the island and one issue leads to looking at something on another issue. And some of these things have underlaid narratives which are increasingly disputed about abandonment, a collapse, eco-disaster, to be blamed on the prehistoric past of Rapa Nui. So now I just want to move a little bit into the present, which is the end of today. And I'm just checking my timing. Yes, I think we can just about do that. So that landscape's out there. It was there for us to go and look at. It's a heritage landscape developed through misfortune of the Rapa Nui community in the early 20th century being basically hemmed in to one place, Hangaroa. So this is Hangaroa today. And Hangaroa is wholly dependent on heritage tourism. That is its main income. And it's until COVID, it was actually going through a sort of very dynamic period, political period, and also what you might call a building boom. So I want to look at this just a little. What is actually threatening that heritage, who manages it, its relationship with tourism and Rapa Nui identity, and how it can hold out and alongside vast environmental threats to a whole landscape of archaeology. This is our favourite supermarket for what it's worth. And a lot of ritual has to take place in Rapa Nui before certain things and activities can take place as archaeologists. So we co-work with a very contemporary but very traditional society in terms of its sense of heritage. So what are the threats? The one that's constantly mentioned across the Pacific, of course, is rising sea level. And I think it does beg a lot of questions. The ceremonial platforms were always by the sea. They've always been shattered to some extent by sea waters. So it's much more important to know whether the 300 are all being worsened at the same rate or different rates. And in fact, some of them are hardly touched at all and others are. And the presumption that all collapse is actually brought about by breakdown of society or by environmental things, as opposed to willful changing of traditions. So in this example, all the statues are sort of very nicely laid down in a very prescribed way and are not necessarily the product of collapse or environmental change. We've done quite a lot of work on modern erosion on the island, and this is commissioned work by Mahunua, the Indigenous peoples management of the island, and also by CONAF, which is the Chilean National Monuments. The greatest disasters overall to Rapa Nui, I would surmise, are 20th century ploughing. This has moved a lot of sediment. A lot of the land is not under ploughing anymore. It particularly relates to one area, Rapa Nui. But what ploughing did was dislodge soil, which then in turn resulted in eucalyptus trees being planted to stop the soil, the water being moved or precipitating moving soil, which in its own right then created another problem, which is eucalyptus leaves are very shiny. So where the trees stop, the water just whooshes off and drives down into the untreed area. So ploughing, planting of eucalyptus, seeding of pasture for the sheep in the early 20th century has brought wild animals who are still there, such as horses. They skim up and dig up the sediment to get at minerals. And then horses themselves are rubbing up against all sorts of monuments and not only smoothing them down, but leaving deposits of their hair. So you know who the culprit is when you get there. The level of erosion through precipitation and lack of plantation and all the things I've described in the preceding slide, you can see here just how dramatic it is. This is a former ceremonial platform. It's not by the sea, it's on top of a cliff, and it's just being eroded away, absolutely weathered away by this whoosh of water and precipitation in the rainy seasons and the huge channels which are created. There's no point doing survey on these things or geophysics or anything else, because you've just got move things standing on deposits which are nothing to do with archaeological time depth. So there are environmental threats to Rapa Nui's tourism. There are land dispute threats. Rapa Nui, the communities of Angaroa, increasingly from the 60s, wanted their land back, and Chile increasingly has given land back to Rapa Nui. And therefore, there are disputes about whose land are the bits that are not given back. So, for instance, this is a Chilean hotel built on land signed over to Chileans by Rapa Nui in the 1920s. So there's constant action and dispute about getting land back. And at the same time, getting land back results in Rapa Nui's building, quite rightly, it's their landscape, right across the landscape. So now these discrete areas, such as Angaroa, are just a small tip in the whole of where settlement is taking place. And of course, that impacts on a fossil heritage landscape. So there are many issues about giving land back, who protects what on this land, and they're not resolved. It's a constant issue. Then there's tourism. Well, until COVID, we had an average of 80,000 persons arriving on the island per year. Their average stay is 3 to 4 days. They come in aeroplanes or they come by boat, but there's no harbour on Rapa Nui, so they have to come off on small boats. They are charged to come on, but it was by the Chilean National Park, and it was a permit which cost $80. If you add that up by 80,000 visitors per annum, you can see the reason that Rapa Nui say they want to manage their own heritage and their own income, rather than have that money taken by CONAF, who manage the national park. So for the last sort of 5, 6 and 7 years, there's been ongoing politics about access to the monuments of Rapa Nui and who has the right to own them. And maybe it's 3 years ago, the Chilean government gave the management of the national park and the monies to Mauhenua. So now Mauhenua manages the monuments of Rapa Nui. Our project has a memorandum of understanding with them, and they have a lot of money to do things. But what they're not interested in at the moment is archaeological research. What they're interested in is preserving their resource and also making it controllable by fencing it off, by moving lots of stones off the landscape into building walls and controlling access to things. So there's a very difficult and interesting friction here, because they are actually protecting the landscape for tourism as well as heritage, and making the decisions about how to control heritage, how to fence it in, where the effort of the money goes, is extremely complex. And as archaeologists, we have to work with that and understand that priorities, which may be our priorities, are not necessarily the priorities of the local communities. So something also interesting I find is that what's happening to Hangaroa. So this is me just finishing the last bit, which is that Hangaroa itself, as the only current town on Rapa Nui, is becoming a place that has to represent what a tourist would want to see. So on the left, you see when Chile was much more directly controlling and working on the island, the types of housing that was provided by the mid-20th century. It's called social housing. It's got 1 or 2 rooms. Or bottom left, you can see how local Rapa Nui have extended and developed their house. The bottom one's the house that I stay in. Then in the middle, there's all the things now that are being done to almost attract tourists. So in the middle, there's a rubbish recycling centre, which is like an upturned canoe, or the top of one of those haripanga. On the bottom slide, there's the entrance to the new school, which looks like one of those routes down to the sea between Ahu. And then as you go right and you get into bigger, more official buildings, they're nothing to do with Rapa Nui. Buildings are being built, which are South Asian inspired and represent wider areas of Polynesia, such as Samoa. So they're much bigger roofed. Or bottom right, the green roof there is called a dicky roof, which is an invention of Hawaii in the 1920s. So this relationship between heritage and tourism is actually beginning to create an urban landscape that satisfies what a tourist would want to see in Polynesia. So I've sort of caught you from the past to the present. I've tried to reposition some popular narratives of Rapa Nui. I've looked at its prehistory. I've highlighted that Rapa Nui heritage is in the present. And I have tried to show how it matters to look at a small island as an island whole and see it as something that in the present has its own right to create its own imagined heritage, as well as protect and monitor access to its monuments via tourists. So it's a very eclectic heritage that lies ahead for Rapa Nui, and I'm fascinated to know what happens post-COVID. So thank you all. Rapa Nui's past is a challenging, interconnected whole. I hope I've shown you some of the challenges, and I must say it's one of the most wonderful places in the world to be working in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Sue. That was a really splendid overview of really fascinating landscape and really broad conspectus of the way that you're approaching it. We've now got time for some questions. If people want to ask questions, I would suggest they put them in the chat, and I will try and act as a sort of the questioner for you while people are thinking for a moment. I just wondered, Sue, I'm fascinated by the insights you've given us into Polynesian cosmology, and I wonder the extent to which the cosmology is something that we're getting at through simply anthropological means, through past ethnographies, and the extent to which you can actually see variations in those cosmologies through the archaeological work in different areas.
It's definitely a bit of both. I started like anybody working in Rapa Nui not like anybody. I didn't start with a strong understanding of Polynesia. It was something I had moved to look at with my colleagues. And previously, and as part of the thing, we went to Hawaii as well. And Hawaii is very interesting because there's much more written about it. And there's much more written by the Hawaiians. So there were ideas that came through at that point. And then we started looking at Rapa Nui with the possibility of those things. And I think you can demonstrate these things by repeated patterns. If you have an idea and it relates to one set of monuments, you're sort of leaping between things in a way that doesn't follow the thread completely. So that was why looking at it on a landscape scale created some of those broad themes of Polynesia rather than precise interpretations. We don't really have an oral history because by the time people were writing about Rapa Nui in terms of interviewing people. There's 250 people.
Mm-hmm.
And although the society was, well, maybe 400 years have gone since the time of what we're looking at. So there are stories and ideas. And also, today I have to work with things you might challenge or say are wrong, but that's what is believed. But I think it controls it in the present. I mean, we can't, for instance, walk on top of Ahu. That's considered inappropriate. So how do you measure or survey if you can't walk on top? So reason tells you as an archaeologist you need to do this, but you would have to work with what local people understand.
That's very interesting indeed. There's a question from John Cooper, who's asking whether you can say more about why the statues face inland, and is there any evidence for any of them facing the other way?
Well, that one, I think most people who go to Rapa Nui think they look out to sea. So even I was quite surprised as I started reading before I went to see that they looked inland. So one has to look at ideas to do with that. They're looking inward to the living, the dead and the crematoria are at the back. I have done work looking at how far you can see the statues from, and each Ahu seems to actually have a territory of vision. So out of that, you could say that they were overlooking their land and the communities associated. So I think it's a very organic project where you work with an idea. What does the statue see? From where can you see the statues? And then you begin to see this sort of use of space. So I would say they are overlooking their land. And I find it interesting that they're overlooking, in some cases, Ranunraraku, from whence they came, and the Ranunraraku eyes are looking out. So I think it's relationship between the living and land and your ancestors, which are what the moai, the statues, represent.
Jim Spriggs is asking about the evidence for indigenous building styles.
Well, in prehistory, they take up general concepts which are present in other parts of Polynesia, such as ceremonial platforms, but they are absolutely developed in Rapa Nui. They tend to lose the complexity of what happens in the plaza, and there's a lot of emphasis on the ceremonial platform and the statues. The boat-shaped houses are unique. The taheta, which are these liquid storage rocks with basins, they're unique to Rapa Nui. So there's indigenous there. And I think actually there's quite a lot of indigenous in the modern architecture. They've got a free-for-all of reinventing themselves, which I think is incredibly important. They're creating their own heritage Polynesia.
Well, not got any other questions coming in at the moment. I'm fascinated by what you're saying about the current politics and around the heritage, and wondering the extent to which there's a conversation going on with the islanders now about how they might develop their exploitation of the heritage now they've been given it its control.
It's very complicated because also there's competition in the islands, on the island, as to who are the main controlling people of Mauhunua, the indigenous peoples community. Their first concern is actually that the monuments are valuable and we need to control, and they need to control how tourists approach them, and that the money that comes from that should go back to the community, not necessarily just for heritage, but to enhance their own personal lifestyles, because obviously that is their main income. So an understanding of what attracts tourists is actually important to them. And if you wish to excavate, for instance, they're very cautious about it because they've got so much on their hands already in terms of protecting access via tourists and conserving. I don't know what Rapa Nui will be like in 100 years' time, because so much of it is crumbling. I mean, these monuments, 1,000 statues with salt precipitation and crumbling away. making decisions about how they are, what is to be preserved is really important.
Katie Whitaker is asking about the investigation of historic cemeteries on the island. Are the islanders allowing investigation, and has there been any?
Right. There are two types of prehistoric burial. One is in the crematoria, so they're basically cremated remains at the back. Possibly with the loss of wood for cremation, they started burying, inhuming statues within, sorry, not statues, people, within the ahu. There's a lot of caution and objection to people going near bones. When we were excavating at Punapau, we found a burial in a cave. We had to stop excavation. We couldn't go and actually test what it was. Some people have had access to some of the skeletal material, but it's a very difficult area. And even trying to get, for instance, from the crematoria, access for radiocarbon dating is not easy or possible.
And there's a question here about how the houses that you showed us the footings of are constructed. Are the socket holes in the stone base plate seem quite shallow? Are the things in tension across them, or how do they work?
Yes, they're curved. So there's Miro trees. There are various types of trees, shrub-like trees, where you can bend or use a palm frond and bend it from one hole across to the other. So they're not at all substantial, but the stone foundation is, and that's the kind of key interface between inside and outside and above ground and below ground.
Well, thank you. So we seem to have run out of
Sure.
questions here, but the chat is full of people saying what a great lecture and what fantastic ideas and images. So if I can thank you on behalf of the Society for a really splendid lecture. And I think we show our appreciation in the normal way. I give notice that the Christmas Miscellany on the 16th of December will take place at 5 p.m. But I regret to say that we've had to decide to do this again online rather than in person. So the planned mulled wine reception will be held over to another time and place. I've also been asked to announce that the talk by Mark Lodvik to the Welsh Fellows on the 21st of January will also only be held online. But take this opportunity to say thank you again to Sue and declare that the meeting is now adjourned.